We are two. This is a One School for All lecture by me, Andrew Thomas, at Østfold University College, which I would like my wonderful international students to watch by Wednesday, the 29th of October 2025. See, I did it before the weekend after all. Okay, so according to stereotypes, we all have a racist aunt, or maybe I'm the only person in the world who doesn't have a racist aunt. And according to the story of the racist aunt, you go to parties with them at Christmas and they're all saying, oh, it's awful that so many foreigners are coming to our country and taking all our jobs and whatever the racial stereotype there is going on now. And then you say, well, don't you like any foreigners? No, I don't like foreigners. And then you say, but you like Fatima at the local shop. And he says, oh yes, Fatima makes the most wonderful samosas. So the racist aunt, according to the stereotype, doesn't like foreigners in principle, but she does like Fatima, who she knows very well and who makes the loveliest samosas. And this is a division I would like you to try and keep in mind, because this distinction between principled attitudes towards particular categories on the one hand, and real life attitudes towards particular names and historical beings is something that has neurological and political resonance. But in order to bring out that resonance, I need to tell you about the idea of two hemispheres, the idea that Iain McGilchrist has presented in, amongst other things, the book The Master and the Emissary. And of course what they can do for us as teachers. So, who is Iain McGilchrist? He was a lecturer, he's still alive, he was a lecturer in literature in Oxford, but after his interest in the mind-body problem, he took a training in medicine and neurology, and eventually also in neurosurgery, and he had a clinical practice. And he still publishes in such different fora as the Times Literary Supplement and the Lancet. But this double expertise, these two PhDs that he's got, both in literature and in neurosurgery and in neurology. Those are the two things that are so unique with his thought and his insights. And in both these extremely difficult contexts, and these days when he publishes, whether that be in literature or in neurology, he is constantly identifying some of the same problems, the physical and neurological effects of art and meaning. And this led him to distinguish between the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, I should warn you that there is another theory of the two hemispheres of the brain that was very popular, like in the 80s and 90s, where you could eat some kind of medicine or take some special vitamins in order to go from being a left brain person or a right brain person, where maths was the kind of thing that only ever happened in the left brain, or there are some things you can only do with your left brain and some things you can only do with your right brain, and you could go on programs and stuff. Almost all of that science was without basis. Whenever we use our brain, we use both sides of the brain. The brain communicates between the hemispheres all the time, whatever it is doing. There is no massive difference between functions, in the sense of most functions use both hemispheres. But through a series of case studies and identifying the behavior and the abilities of people who have damages to different hemispheres, Iain McGilchrist has identified the different manners of the brain. So it's a question of the manner of the brain, not the function. When you read him, it almost feels like personality. I'm not sure if that's a helpful distinction, but that's the way it feels when you read him. So everything is both functions. When you are doing art and when you're doing maths, you use both hemispheres of the brain. But there are still really striking differences between people whose one hemisphere of their brain has been kind of cut out. So although they never act alone, we can say that when your left hemisphere is activated less, is stimulated less, then your right hemisphere will be more in use. And by doing that, we can tell what the various hemispheres, what their manner is, what they bring to the table on in the functions that both of them do. And the kind of summary of the research is, and I must warn you, the book that I've read about this is like 1,600 pages long, so you can't boil it really down to such a simple thing. But I'm going to have to right here and right now. So in general, we can say that the left hemisphere it brings to the table categories. It is blind to unique new phenomena, but it is very good at applying categories to something that you present to it. So it's blind, and it filters for logic and procedure. So so if you give it one thing, it can tell you what another. So the famous all men are mortal, Socrates as a man, that's the kind of thing the left brain is very good at. The left brain brings abstract thinking and yet at the same time very literal thinking. It's very verbal. A lot of the speech of speech relies very heavily on things that happen in the left hemisphere, although speech itself, of course, is both hemispheres. And the left hemisphere struggles to change course, struggles to be interrupted. Now, the right hemisphere is the opposite in many ways, and the right hemisphere sees all sorts of things. It sees unique phenomena without having to boil it down to a particular category or variable. It also detects implicit meaning. It doesn't insist on being literal. And the right hemisphere is more closely connected to the body or the body image. We can say that where the left hemisphere is blind, the right hemisphere is mute. But the right hemisphere listens, understands poetically, and it is open to interruptions and self-correction, crucially, self-correction. So to sum up some of this, Iain McGilchrist says the left hemisphere is faster where it is faster, as long as the stimulus is clear and familiar, and a stock response is required. If there is any ambiguity or uncertainty about the stimulus, or if it is unfamiliar, or the stock response is not what is required, it is the right hemisphere that is more accurate. The right hemisphere's devil's advocate tendencies. Is there another way of seeing this? Lose it the lead by milliseconds when the response needs to be quick and dirty, but they win out everywhere else where a more thoughtful response is required, because the right hemisphere is more in touch, more nuanced in weighing up what is going on, and more insightful across the board. And you can tell that Iain McGilchrist kind of wants you to emphasize the right hemisphere more. And there is a thesis about society underneath here that he thinks that our educational systems and our cultures give more priority to the left hemisphere in the way it values logic over intuition, for example. Now, I hope the link to testing and the work you did with your presentations and also the link to assessment for learning and fixed assessment criteria is fairly clear. The left hemisphere, its manners can get bogged down in data, whereas the right wants to ask what else is going on. And crucially, the right wants to know what effect I myself am having on the situation, as a lot of you brought out in your presentations. So, unlike this kind of fake version of the hemisphere thesis in the 80s, it's not just a matter of art versus science, the fuzzy or the techie. There are scientific problems with left hemisphere observation, and not just artistic criticisms of the left hemisphere. Iain McGilchrist thinks that if you want to be a good scientist, and not least in areas such as physics and astrophysics, then you need to activate your right hemisphere to a much greater extent than you have done previously, or we've been teaching people to do in the past. So why does this make a difference to us teachers? And the question is, we talked about this in the presentations, whose brains do we need to be thinking about? And we tend to think about pupil brains, but we need to pay attention to our own as well. And it worries me that we are learning processes that require maturity and self-insight of our pupils, but are intended to work regardless of the self-insight and personality of the teacher who applies this technique. So I'm thinking of, for example, psychometric testing, but also assessment for learning. Given that we have discussed left hemisphere skills such as recognizing things and sorting things out, special needs education and organizing classrooms, it's an open question what a right hemisphere skill, or a skill that relies on the manners and the strengths of the right hemisphere, what that would look like. Does it even make sense to ask that we learn to read a class like a piece of art? For my part, I like this thing that he says of allowing to see things differently. And I'd be happy if all of us more often ask the question, what else do you see? I'll see you in class.